Hello and welcome again. My name is Luke Walton, and I'm introducing two great people who are speaking on the world's oldest church, Seven Songs from Isseos. One is poet artist Roger Wagner, and he's got a book of poems that are inspired by having come into contact with the world's oldest church, which Professor Historian and author Michael Peppard has written about. And if you haven't caught the first, which sets the scene for this ancient city of Dura Europos, do go and have a look at segment one. But we're now going to be talking about Roger's second visit to Dura and when he goes to Yale University afterwards. So, Roger, you had been once to this city and you had come across the world's oldest church, but then you go back for a second visit. One is not enough for you. Tell us about it.
Yeah, no, well, I was so inspired by that first visit, but also by Syria generally, and I just wanted to do more painting there. So I went back 2 years later in 1998, and intending to paint there. But in fact, we arrived in Dura in the middle of a sandstorm, which was a very, very dramatic kind of moment because I've never been in a sand. The whole sky goes yellow and you can't see anything at all. It's not a good time to sort of start painting. But at that point, I went back to the church because when I'd first been there, I had no idea that I'd heard something about there being paintings there, but I hadn't seen any of them. But when I went back, I'd heard that there was paintings, and particularly one of Peter and Jesus walking on water, which had been a sort of theme that I'd been painting for many years. So and also that these were actually the earliest known Christian paintings, which made it for me an incredibly moving place to go to. But the question was, where were these paintings? I guess they might have gone to Yale. I hadn't read anything about the church. There was actually it wasn't that easy to find things about them, but someone at the National Gallery, I'd been to a sort of conference, and they said, yes, the pictures were at Yale, but you couldn't see them any longer because when they'd been taken, to New Haven, they began to deteriorate, and so they took them off show. But I happened to be going out to my nephew was at the Yale School of Art, and I went out to sort of see him, and I got in touch with Megan Doyen from the Yale Art Museum, who I know is a great help to Michael when he was writing the book, and she very kindly took us out to this extraordinary. It was like a sort of scene from Indiana Jones, sort of the end when they go into that great warehouse, because we were taken to this huge warehouse, and she went and got the picture of Peter walking on water, which incredibly sort of vivid colors, and this was, I think it must be the earliest datable picture of Jesus. It was extraordinary, and there he was walking on water, which, as I say, was a sort of theme that I'd been painting for almost 20 years at that point.
That certainly sounds like a very moving experience to find that your creative, apparently original sort of thematic has got this ancient connection. But Michael, tell us a bit about this fresco and the Odes of Solomon, because that's right, is it? Is this the earliest image of Jesus?
Well, it certainly competes for that. So I always qualify when I talk about this as the world's oldest church that it is the earliest securely datable church building. And what I mean by that is that we know from archaeological strata and dated coinage that this was buried no later than the year 256 AD or 256 of the Common Era. So in terms of the earliest Christian art, the very, very oldest sections of the Roman catacombs would have something to say about this. So Catacomb of Priscilla, for example, one could make a case that there are some paintings from the early 200s in there. However, those catacombs were in continued use, and so it's very difficult for historians and archaeologists to say this is from 200 and this is from 300 and this is from 350, right? It's difficult. So I stick with world's oldest church because it's absolutely the oldest non-burial space, right? If we think about the catacombs as primarily burial spaces for art. So earliest images of Jesus then would be both panels of the upper wall. So this is the upper register of a 2-register artistic program. And on the upper register, we have 2 miracle stories: Jesus healing the paralytic, which appears in all 4 gospels in some form, and Jesus walking on the water, which appears not in all 4, and it only appears once, in which Peter also joins him walking on the water. So that's what we call the Gospel of Matthew, although the canon was less stable, of course, in the early 200s than it came to be later. So I have to say that the biblical reference is that, but overall, the idea of walking on water as power over the natural world, I think, is important. And this goes back to Genesis 1, right? That the fact that open water is scary. Open water is chaos. Open water is where the chaos monster might be lurking underneath. And so there's a kind of order and dominion that has to take place over these dangers of open water. And we see that in Jesus' own walking on the water epiphanies, for example, in the Gospel of Mark. And here in the Gospel of Matthew, we have a theme of empowerment, where the power that Jesus has is also empowering one of his disciples to walk in the way that he walks, or to walk in his footsteps even. Of course, Peter sinks, right? And so then the question is, for the art historian of this piece, is which of the figures is Jesus and which is Peter? And I'll say here that it's not for sure. And I say in the book it's not for sure. One of the challenges is that when the art was restored, the restorers painted what looked like some waves over one of the bodies that make it look as if the lower body might be underwater. Wow. The challenge with that is that the so-called sinking Peter art form doesn't appear much before the modern era, if at all. And so it's really kind of a 19th century thing. My own grandparents' church had a sinking Peter. I think of it when I was bored in church as a child, looking at this image on the wall. So I went with the idea that Peter is not yet sinking, that he is not floundering at this point, that he is empowered and walking on the water. So that's what I went with, and that's what led me to Ode 39 of the Odes of Solomon, which is preserved in Syriac and is likely a 2nd century set of poems, perhaps 3rd century, but either way, right in the heart of the Dura timeline. And Ode 39 is very clearly about a river crossing, which we have here as the Euphrates. There's no lakes in the middle of the Syrian desert, right? There's no Sea of Galilee to walk on. There's only rivers or wadis from rainstorms. So this river crossing image in which the anointed, the Messiah, walks across the river and leaves a firm footpath for someone to follow him behind and crossing the river. It is on the one hand clearly an Exodus reference, and early Christians were known to use baptismal imagery in connection with the Red Sea crossing of the Exodus as an image of salvation. So it's clearly that. But the setting of the river, I think, places it more specifically here next to the Euphrates. And so I thought Odes of Solomon 39 was a nice text to think with, even if they weren't singing it or holding it in the church themselves in the year 250. I think it's from the same kind of spiritual milieu that they were thinking with.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. And Roger, you've responded to this with another of your poems. I wonder if you would read that for us as well.
Yes, just before I do, the picture that I've put it with is one of the. I've done, as I said, many pictures of Peter walking on water, of which indeed you were the model for Peter in one of those early ones. And I've actually also, in a later picture, I did actually do the sort of sinking one, but I've more sort of seen it as the kind of reaching out in sort of faith.
Yes.
But on this, the picture that I put with this poem was was actually again done on a rivet, but it was the Thames. It was slightly inspired by Francis Thompson's wonderful picture when he sort of talks of seeing Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret but Thames. And so I've got the two figures walking on the Thames, and I've in the poem, which is kind of a version of Ode 39. I've taken that and I've on the walls of some of these pictures, as we'll talk about next time, there are some names sort of scratched on there, and so I've as it were scratched the name of Isseos, who was the sort of convert who gives the sort of title to this sort of series. I've sort of scratched his name, as it were, into the poem. So anyway, that's this is poem number 3. 7 songs for Isseos, number 3. Ode 39, from the Odes of Solomon. Great rivers are the power of the Lord. They sweep away those who despise him, who are caught in the current, who are carried away, body and soul. They are swifter than running lightning, yet those who cross them in faith will not be moved. Those who walk on them without fault will not perish.
The Lord is a sign for them standing upon the rivers. He is a sign for all who cross the great rivers in the name of the Lord. Put on the name of the Most High, and you will cross without danger. The rivers will be subject to you, and you will know him. I, Isseos, will call on the name of the Lord, and I, Isseos, will put on the name of the Lord. For the Lord has bridged them with his word. He has walked on the rivers. He has crossed them by foot, and his footsteps stand firm upon the waters. And my footsteps stand firm upon the waters. And I, Isseos, will walk with him, and I will not fail. And I walk with him, and I am not swept away. Hallelujah.